Do you think that there's almost going to be a shift in globalization back to a more community-orientated view of the world after this whole pandemic blows over?
Yes, and it's happening
Mm.
quite rapidly, and part of it is being driven by the collapse in supply chains that has occurred. Shipping
Mm.
globally is way down. Of course, the airline industry is on life support, to use an unfortunate metaphor.
Mm.
Um, and as a result of these, and there's a great deal of suspicion among certain important countries like the United States and China are regarding each other very suspiciously. Did a laboratory in Wuhan inadvertently release the virus? China is supposedly now surveilling and trying to steal secrets from labs in the U.S. that are working on vaccines. All of these things going on. So the result of all of this is that there is more and more stress in the fabric of globalization itself. The fabric is starting to tear. Then within countries, certain countries more than others, I would say the United States primarily, where you have an ineffectual or incompetent central government, regions are starting to break off because they're not seeing effective leadership at the top. Here in the United States, state governments were not able to rely on the federal government to procure PPE, personal protective equipment, or ventilators, or any of the other necessary materials and machines that they needed to fight the virus locally. So they were left to their own resort. I think what we're seeing in the U.S. is potentially the breakdown of the federal system, and I would not be too surprised to see over the course of the next several months some pretty dramatic political events that result in a greater localization of political control and economic activity. Unfortunately, in the US, I think it's going to be a pretty violent process, and I shudder to think what that may mean. That said, the trend away from globalization is one that we should have foreseen a long time ago, and I've been talking about this for a couple of decades now. It's been based on globalization has been based on cheap fossil fuels. Without cheap fossil fuels for international trade and travel and for international communications, without a global financial system that's backed up by global communication, globalization could not have occurred. And it's a trend that has seen its time come and go. We've seen cycles throughout history of increasing global integration, like the buildup of the Roman Empire. And then those cycles naturally come to an end, and there's a release of that kind of complexity back to a smaller scale, more localized way of organization. And all of the signs are that we have reached the culmination of that global cycle of integration represented by globalization, and that we're passing into a new phase. I think it's going to be fairly chaotic, at least it's in many ways, but it's something we could have easily foreseen. And there are ways of managing the unraveling, if you will, that would minimize, human suffering and the loss of knowledge. This is one of the things that I'm most concerned about. We've spent the last number of decades building up human knowledge in many areas. We figured out the human genome. We built the Hubble Space Telescope. We figured out biological evolution to a very large degree, not entirely, but we've made big strides, on and on and on. And if we lose electricity grids, for example, all of that would disappear very quickly, because it's all stored on computer hard drives. That's why I'm in favor of developing renewable energy as much as we can, so that we can maintain an electrical grid infrastructure as a transitional strategy toward whatever's in the future. If the transition is abrupt and civilization collapses entirely and quickly, then I think we're in for not only a humanitarian tragedy, but also a cultural tragedy that could be prevented.